Welcome, everyone. I'm Bill Jeffries. I'm Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education, and I'm glad everyone could make it here tonight. This lecture is sponsored by the Larner Scholars Program, and Dr. Robert Larner, as many of you may know, is an alum from the class of 1942 who lives in California with his wife, Helen. And he's very well known around here, but let me reiterate some of the things we have to be grateful for from Dr. Larner. First is his passion for providing financial aid for our medical students, and particularly through the highly favorable Larner Loan Program that he founded a few years ago. Also is his dedication to thinking creatively about enhancing medical education here at UVM. The Larner Classroom down the hall is a true gem, and has been transforming the way we teach our students. He also contributed to our simulation program, enabling our students to learn auscultation skills using our Harvey simulators. And I know Dr. Larner wishes he was here today, but we're going to be sending him the video of this. So hello, Bob and Helen, and thank you for everything. And everybody wave to the camera here for Bob. That's great. Thank Bob. Bob also founded the Larner Scholars Lectures, and they traditionally have a focus on leadership. So we're fortunate to have a true leader in global health today with us, Dr. Majid Sadigh. And I'm fortunate to be able to call Dr. Sadigh a valued colleague, but also, more importantly, a friend. When we first considered whom to select as this year's Larner Scholar, Majid immediately came to mind, since he represents a combination of scholarly achievement, expert clinical skill, and a towering commitment to global health. And this is before we knew he was going to Liberia. So Dr. Sadigh graduated from Shiraz University Medical School, is that the way to pronounce that, Majid? Sorry, in Iran, and completed his residency at St. Mary's Hospital in Connecticut, and an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Chicago. He served as Associate Program Director of the Yale Primary Care Program and as Associate Professor of Medicine at Yale School of Medicine for many years. Majid became associated with the University of Vermont when he became the Director of Global Health at Danbury Hospital, our affiliate, in June of 2012. In that short amount of time, he has built a global health education network at Danbury from scratch to benefit our students, residents, and faculty. And in fact, we were just talking about one of our residents who came back yesterday or recently from Uganda. Dr. Sadigh is a veteran of medical missions from around the world and has trained physicians and provided patient care in areas like Uganda, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Guyana, East Timor, Sri Lanka, and the Dominican Republic. Dr. Sadigh is here to present an account of his most recent global health experience entitled Autumn in Liberia, the American response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Please welcome our Robert Larner, MD lecturer, Dr. Majid Sadigh. Thank you.
Thank you for generous introduction, Dr. Jeffries. And this afternoon, probably in the next 45 minutes, what I'm trying to do is focusing on virus, maybe very briefly on his life cycle, the outbreaks of the Ebola virus in the past as well as recently, and then the American response, particularly to the recent events and interests and the concerns of the potential volunteers who basically were willing to join the forces to fight against Ebola. Then particularly focusing on the time of the epidemic of fear and how during the epidemic of fear really we respond to Ebola epidemic, both in United States as well as West Africa, but my focus is going to be mainly on West Africa. And definitely based on my personal observations and also reviewing the literature, and then finally put some face behind some of the stories that you have seen, talking a little about the people that we have seen in Liberia and particularly in Ebola treatment centers or Ebola treatment units. And then finally, I'm going to really be very brief on where should we be going from now. The lessons that we learned, how we need really to apply to the prevention of these sort of diseases in future. What has been amazed me about the virus is such a simple, elegant virus. It is 100-million-year-old virus and has only 10 proteins, has 6 structural proteins and 4 functional proteins. And all of those things that it's doing is based on very tiny nucleotide sequences of close to 19,000. The only thing that comes to my mind in the field of the microbiology is the agent of syphilis. That's also tiny, and the codons are very minimum, and the number of the proteins, functional or structural, are very minimal, and still has those diversity of the clinical spectrum when you are coming to syphilis. And you know the classification of the filoviruses, obviously is philo because it looks like filament, like a piece of rope, is in a matter of fact very big. If you compare the size of the Ebola virus to measles virus, is about 300, 400 times bigger than the measles virus. But the genomic part of the virus is very small. And you know that is Marburg was the first one that was discovered in Marburg in Germany. And then obviously is Ebola Sudan, Ebola Zaire, Ebola Reston, and that is not really a human pathogen, is mainly the pig pathogen, and human only is seroconverting, but is not really coming with any disease. And Ebola Ivory Coast, which happened only in one person in Ivory Coast. It was one of the pathologists basically doing necropsy on a dead chimp. And then during the procedure, obviously, unfortunately, had a needle injury and then came down with Ebola. And she survived, but is only the single person so far with Ebola Ivory Coast. And we do not know the natural history or the survival or the death from the Ebola Ivory Coast. And also you need to remember when we learn about the Ebola in West Africa, it was kind of really natural at the beginning to think that this is going to be Ebola Ivory Coast because that's the common border with the Guinea, and but it turned to be basically Zaire, but in a new formulation of the Ebola virus. And then obviously Ebola, Bundi, Bunju in Uganda. So these are the classification and the life cycle. Just the only thing that I want to focus, the cycle of the virus in bat particularly is presumptive as we are speaking. Later on I will show you some literature that in Marburg now we can close the book and we say the Marburg virus, the natural reservoir is the bat, is the Egyptian fruit bat, and I will show some literature on that. But when you come to Ebola, not really the Marburg virus, we have discovered the serological marker of the Ebola in some fruit bats. We have seen pieces of the RNA in the tissue of the fruit bats, certainly in 3 species of the fruit bats, and more recently in one of the more common migratory bats in Liberia, in Guinea, that I'm going to show you the literature, but proliferative virus coming from a bat, Ebola, a virus coming from a bat, this is something that still had not happened. But even in Marburg, when we know that the virus is basically in the body of the bat, but we don't know really how the virus is maintaining itself in the bat population, because it's only 5% of the bats and they are going to carry the virus. And later on, I'm going to talk more about, in a matter of fact, of the bats and the viruses that they carry with themselves. But all that we need to know, some way the virus that maybe is in bat only is going to get to the gorilla and other animals in the field, and then kills the gorillas, kills the chimps and monkeys very fast. One of the surprising pieces of the evidence of this epidemic was the fact there was no any dead gorilla or no chimps dead in Guinea or in Sierra Leone or in Liberia. And later on, I would explain to you why that story was that way, because this was completely different type of the virus, and I would shed a little more light on that. But previously, if you go, for instance, to a place in Congo that you will see Ebola outbreak, 3 months before that, many of the parks, they would completely depleted of the chimps or gorillas. All of them would be dead before finally the virus is going to get to the human. But when it gets to the human, unfortunately, finally it gets to the hospital, and because the Ebola has no specific sign and the symptoms, and the doctors are not prepared, they don't have really any good isolation techniques, they don't have any personal protective equipment, and unfortunately become nosocomial, and then the hospitals are going to be shut down, the same thing that happened during the summertime in many of the major cities in West Africa. And then obviously the dead, and then this is the ceremonial, basically traditional funeral in Africa that unfortunately fuels the epidemic. And as we are speaking, one of the reasons that we have not yet controlled the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone or Guinea, because 50% of the bodies still, they go through the traditional, basically, burial. While in Liberia, that the confinement has been so successful because there is no one anymore really doing unsafe burial. And this is only a photo from the Kikwit epidemic of the Ebola virus in Congo. It happened in 1995, and the index case, which is the dead person in this figure, in this picture, in this photo, and you can see basically the intimacy of the relatives, the kids, the females, the wife, with the dead. And there are many different ways of the burials, but I had the opportunity to talk to a couple of really African friends in Liberia to tell me exactly what they do in their tribe. But I know, for instance, sometimes they have really to clean the interior of the body with hands, no gloves, and then they wash the body, and then they use the water that they wash the body with that water to basically wash their own face, or even to take a few sips of that water. That's the reason that almost some of the series, 20% of the epidemic, the drive, the force, and the fuel comes from the unsafe burials in West Africa. I think really in this picture, just many of them, they are dead. I know that almost 11 of this group, they died after really this burial ceremony in 1995. And this is also to show you that we were aware of the epidemic of the Ebola. There were almost 27 epidemic of the Ebola before the big epidemic or the new epidemic of the West Africa. And it happened really, and I will tell you really why it happened, but please remember that when you're looking at the epidemic, you would say Uganda, in matter of fact, is number one as far as the number of the epidemic of the filoviruses in the entire really world. But the scope of the epidemic, obviously, was unimaginable. But in March, if you look at this one, January, February, March, you remember the first case is happening on 24th of the December of 2013. And then if you look, then by April, everybody was kind of really satisfied that the epidemic is going to be confined. CDC withdrew every person from basically Guinea, and you would see that, for instance, in Liberia, the epidemic is coming down, and then if you look at the Guinea, also you can see the curve is coming really down very slowly but very nicely. So everybody said, listen, we have experience with 27, 28 epidemic, and this is classic picture of the Ebola epidemic. So they washed their hands, they came out, and then you would see the epidemic roared back in the major city, particularly in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, and then obviously in Monrovia, the capital city of the Liberia. So this was completely a total surprise to those who were tuned to the pace of the Ebola. It was kind of really absolutely surprised. But this was not the reason that United States really respond so well to the epidemic. The reason that the United States respond to the epidemic because the virus flied on the aeroplane and went to Nigeria, went to Spain, and came to United States. In United States, really, we didn't have really very many cases, except 2 primary cases of the Ebola. As you remember, 2 of the nursing staff, they acquired disease in Texas, and that was the only 2 cases really that they acquired the disease in the United States. But obviously, you remember the frenzy of the media during that time. So the response of the United States was mainly, I think, was to control and confine the epidemic in United States. And you remember many case scenarios from the closing the borders, no flight to the West Africa, to basically let's go to the West Africa, and this is the source of the epidemic, and we need really to confine the epidemic in its source. And many of us will receive a letter from Infectious Disease Society of America or from Consortium of University of the Global Health. Particularly, this letter came to infectious disease specialists that please, we need you people to go to West Africa. And obviously, if you are infectious disease student like me, you will say, my goodness, this is really amazing opportunity. Forget about the humanitarian part. This is a call that you need to go. But, it's a mystery. This Ebola virus is a really mystifying disease. And still it is. It comes, it goes away, then comes after 2 years or maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. And as we were speaking, though we know much of the virus in the test tube, but we don't know how the virus really kills, how the virus really is doing its job in the body of the victim. And I will tell you later on the story really why that is so. But my main interest also was basically you can't really go to Uganda and not becoming really interested in filoviruses. And I have been in Uganda since 2000, in a matter of fact. This is the only country in the entire world that has both filoviruses, has Marburg virus and has also Ebola virus. It's only country that has 2 strains of the Ebola virus, has the Ebola Sudan and has also Budubunju virus. And more importantly, the first case of the Marburg was a tourist, a Belgian tourist, who went to the Mount Elgon, very famous cave Kitam. But those days, CDC sent really a big group, and they could not really identify the reservoir of the virus. They got almost 900,000 different types of the insects, mammals you mentioned, but they couldn't really find even a trace of the virus in them. But that's not because the Uganda is on the map of the filoviruses. It's the famous or infamous cave of Kitaka cave. It's very close to the Queen Elizabeth Park, and 100,000 of the Egyptian fruit bats, they live in this cave. 100,000. And then you can see these are the CDC people in basically blue suit, and you're going to basically, you're here to capture some of these bats. In 2007, 4 of the miners who were doing some mining in this cave, they came down with the Marburg, and then CDC captured many, many bats, and 13 out of 600 of the bats, they did have antibody, and then 31 out of 600 of them, they had pieces of the RNA, but more importantly, in 5 of the bats, they identified the entire genome of the virus that was multiplying, and they could really inject it to the guinea, and the guinea pig came down with the virus. So they fulfilled basically the hypothesis that basically this virus is a pathogen, and it lives in the Egyptian bats. So, but still, we do not know really how it circulates itself in Egyptian bats. Is only 5% of these bats, they are infected, but they're doing completely fine. They don't die from the Marburg virus, and they are projecting that is close to 5,000 infected bats in Kitaka Cave. But the other thing that they did, they labeled almost 2,000 of these bats because they want to know exactly the migration pathway of these bats. And then 2008, a 41-year-old Dutch woman with her husband, they went to a phyton cave. And I have been to a phyton cave like many other basically tourists. You go to this phyton cave because you want to look at the phytons, because they eat the plenty number of the bats, and just you would see them sleeping down lazily. And many of the tourists, they go and to watch for the basically phyton. And there are many snakes, in a matter of fact, in this cave, and they are all engorged with the bats. And it amazed me that you can see them just, the phyton grab, 100 of the bats, and the bats, they don't really react at all. And they are just sitting there, and they are welcoming the snakes and phyton. And this woman, we don't know what did, but this woman, unfortunately, came down with Marburg and did not survive. Went to Amsterdam and died in Amsterdam in 2008 after, I think, really very short course of the disease. And then CDC sent really, again, group to capture some of these bats and identify some of the bats that they released in the other cave, which was 300 miles away. So then they proved that, in a matter of fact, the bats, they migrate from one part to another, and if they are infected in one place, they are going to infect another rooster part of the place as well. But I think really Ebola, when I look at the filoviruses, is an epidemic of fear. There is some sort of really unknown reason that really we are afraid of this virus. And I want really to tell you that that was a major concern, that many of us, we didn't like to go to Liberia. Forget about the academic centers that unfortunately did not support the academician to go to Liberia. I think really, your university is kind of really exceptional, because 2 of us, we were supported to go to Liberia. Margaret is here and me. So both of us, we were supported, in a matter of fact, to go to Liberia. But I think really, I was talking to my colleagues at Yale, and they had a couple of really meetings, and there was no any support for any of the volunteer academicians to go to Liberia. But most of the people, obviously, they were concerned that they may come down with the Ebola, and they may really die from the Ebola. And particularly also they were concerned when they're coming back home, what would be the reaction of the American citizens to the healthcare workers from the United States that they have spent time in hot zone. So let me just tell you that first, in the next maybe several slides, I want just to prove to you that this is not very infectious virus. And this is the Kisisi ethnic group. And if you look at the Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia, this is the ethnic group that lives in this part of the West Africa, and they don't recognize any boundary. And this is a big ethnic group. So goes to Sierra Leone, goes to Guinea, goes to Liberia, back and forth. And also, they are very, very young, because the Africa is very young when you come to the population. 20 years ago, Africa contribution to the human population was only 10%, but now the population of the Africa is more than 1 billion. So it is easy to say that overwhelming majority of the Africans, they are very young. They are 30 or less of the age, and they have no job. So they go between Guinea to Liberia to Sierra Leone, back and forth. And then this is Miliondu village. This is the famous or infamous, because this is the index case happened in Miliondu village. And you need to remember, filoviruses, they need roads. To go from one place to another place, they need roads. Probably 200 years ago, we did have the outbreak of Ebola in many parts of the Africa. But among a tribe, 3-4 people would die, but tribe couldn't really go 1 mile beyond. So the Ebola outbreak would be confined. But now we are connected. Even tiny, small village in Liberia, you would see there are motorbikes, motorcycles, and there's already mud roads, goat roads, but you can see a truck on it. So they are connected. And this is only, I think, really about 20-25 of the family, they are living in Miliondu. And Miliondu is at the midst of the rainforest. So far, all of the Ebola outbreak or Marburg outbreak, they happened in rainforests. Some places that the human, for the first time, intrudes into the mother nature. And then you would see this boy when he was a newborn, and he's, I think, really in this picture is 1. But then when he's 2 years, he comes down with the disease. Obviously, nobody knows that this is the Ebola, but retrospectively, everybody's surprised. How come the index person in this new epidemic is a 2-year-old boy? He's not hunter. He doesn't kill the bats. How come really the index case is the boy and 2 year? And then a group of the German recently, and they went and they saw this tree, and because this tree was basically rooster place for the migrant bats, as soon as the villager, they learn about the Ebola and the collection of the Ebola with the bats, they burned this tree, but still the Germans, they could identify the RNA pieces of the Ebola virus, as well as a new species of the bats in trunk of this tree. And this was only about 10 meters away from the home or the house of this 2-year-old boy. And the assumption is basically that this boy was basically coming and playing a lot. In a matter of fact, even they saw the sticks that this boy was playing with that stick in close to this tree. So unfortunately, some way, this boy was contaminated with the virus. But we don't know exactly how. The details of it is not clear. If this becomes proved, is now soft evidence, this is going to be the first time that insect-eating bat has been associated with Ebola. And that's not a good news, because the insect-eating bats, they are migrating sometimes 800 miles during the migration season between the winter and the summer. So this means basically the virus can be anywhere in Africa. But if you look at Miliondu, the boy came down with the disease and then gave it to her mother, his mother. And then the mother was pregnant. She died because pregnant women, they die very quick from filoviruses. And then gave it to his sister. The sister died. Grandmother was taking care of them. Grandmother came down with Ebola, but grandmother didn't stay in Miliondu. Took a truck, went to Dawa. So now the disease is in Dover. And then between Meliandou and Kekedu is only half an hour, basically, on this dirt road. And unfortunately, the virus from a midwife relative got to Dondu, Pombo, which is very close to this village. And unfortunately, as soon as you know that it is in midwife, a doctor, that's not a good news. Because you know it's going to be a nosocomial disease, and then you would see what happened here from the healthcare worker line to the Macenta in Guinea. And Macenta, unfortunately, is a big city, and it's very close to a road that goes to the capital. So now the virus is, practically speaking, is unleashed on main roads. And then you would see this is basically by a doctor from Macenta now is in Kisidugu. And now you're talking about the March of 3rd. This is the 3rd month, basically. And we have, I think, 64 cases. So you would say 64 cases. I would say, hey, listen, this is Africa. This is Ebola unleashed. Nobody knows about the Ebola. And Ebola goes from one village to another village. And the family members, they are taking care of the basically sick. And the sick person dies. And everybody goes through the traditional African ceremonies. Why only 64? If this virus is very contagious, it should be 64,000. Particularly in Macenta, which has almost 100,000 population, we have only 64 patients over 3 months when the virus was absolutely unleashed. Though we did have the study, in a matter of fact, from Kikwit study in 1995, that 16%, only 16% of the family members who have been directly taking care of the index patient or a patient with Ebola, they would come down with Ebola. And if the family members, they are living under the same roof, but there is no any contact with that person, none would come down with Ebola. So Ebola is not contagious. There is something later on I will show you that, in a matter of fact, is susceptibility of the host that determines who is going to come down with Ebola and who is not going to come down with Ebola. Then, unfortunately, you know the story that, because all of these communities, Ketekdu, Macenta, they are on the major highway, and then got to the Faranaha, and then to, obviously, Conakry, the capital of the Guinea. Now, it was in the big cities, and then big cities, they have aeroplanes. Then, obviously, you remember that he went to Nigeria, flying on the flights, and then went to Spain, and then came to United States. So the second question is going to be really, forget about the people. Just focus on healthcare workers, and let's see how many really of the healthcare workers so far, they have gone down with Ebola. Because that's really very good question. Because if you want to convince your friend, go to West, Africa, then you need at least to give that person some data. So let's see what is the Ebola and healthcare workers. The study, I just really focus on MSF because MSF has the best, robust, basically, studies. And you can see, basically, the major question is going to be how many MSF staff members have been infected with Ebola in the field, and why were they infected given the precaution taken? Because if they had the PPEs and they used the PPEs, why did they come down with Ebola? And if you look at the study, because MSF was involved from March, in a matter of fact, in outbreak of the Ebola, more than 3,300 MSF members, they were sent, basically they were working for in use of the MSF, and 700 of them are expatriate. So it's better to exclude those who are local, because the local, you never really understand what is the source. And when I was talking to many of them, and they told me that really healthcare workers, they did come down with Ebola because they were taking care of the sick family members, because there are not very many of the healthcare workers in West Africa. So 20 of these 23 that they acquired Ebola, they were national, and you can see 13 of them, they died, but 3 of them were internationals, and all of them, they survived, and all of them, they acquired the disease, not in the hot zone. They acquired the disease particularly in triaging area. And I'll show you one of the pictures from downloading, from the basically websites, and you can see this is the patient which is suspect of Ebola, and this is the expatriate nurse or a doctor. This is not the way that you are going to take care of somebody who has Ebola. That's the breach in the protocol. Obviously, that was the reason that many of the healthcare workers, in a matter of fact, they did come down with Ebola. And then the next question is, assume that you're coming down with Ebola, what will be the outcome? So I proved to you it is not very contagious. I told you that if you're particularly working in a hot zone, nobody is going to come down with Ebola. We don't have any example. We have one example of one person that got Ebola in the hot zone, and that was the needle injury. Needle injury. Had the needle in his hand, a syringe in his hand, could not really basically dispose it, had to go to a place almost 10, 20 meters away, and then unfortunately came down with the needle injury, and he survived. He came to the United States and he survived. And look, we have 839 so far. This is the most recent statistic from WHO side. We have 839 basically healthcare workers that they came down with Ebola, and 491 of them, they died. So the mortality, in a matter of fact, among the healthcare worker is more than the mortality among the public. And still we do not know why, but the hypothesis is basically they are repeatedly exposed to the high inoculum of the Ebola. But if we look at the expatriates and how many of them they died, and if you exclude those that they reached to the United States, not terminal phase, the mortality is 0%. If you consider those that they came to the United States terminally ill, like American Sierra Leone surgeon that by the time got ready to the United States, all of his organs were shut down because unfortunately the tests repeatedly in his body and his blood was negative for Ebola. That was the reason they didn't really send the patient to the United States quick, and the patient died. So in good hand, in good center, Ebola is curable. So why worry? If you want really to do something good, this is not a virus to be very scared of. And also, if you come down with Ebola, there is treatment ready for Ebola, not treatment, often supportive care. The German case did not receive any sort of really experimental medication and survived. The nurse in Spain didn't get any experimental medication, and the nurse survived. And more importantly, really, to be honest, there was phenomenally perspective published in New England Journal of Medicine, and they said, really, listen, we have been licensed to serve humanity. And this is basically Matthew Lukwia, a hero in Uganda. He died of Ebola, and this is what he said. He said, it is our vocation to save life. And more importantly, when you go to Gulu and you would see his grave by 13 more of the healthcare workers that they all died in epidemic of the Ebola in Gulu, this is what is written on his grave. Oh God, I am dying in my service. When I die, let me be the last. And in a matter of fact, he was the last person. He died, and epidemic basically gone completely from the Gulu in 2000. So anyway, I think really many of the Americans, they volunteered their time to go to the West Africa. The United States system was fantastic, I shall say. You can see, obviously, fund particularly came from many sources, but $450 million came from Washington, and then 64 other countries, they increased that money to $2.2 billion. And the money, obviously, everybody was working with government of the Liberia. The technical advisors to us were CDC and WHO. We were trained before going to Liberia by CDC in Alabama. And then when I think the building the ETUs was responsibility of the Defense Department of Defense, the American servicemen and women. And you would see basically one of the non-governmental organizations was in charge of the staffing these units, and the organization that we went through and Margaret went through was AmeriCares, and AmeriCares was responsible for 3 of the ETUs in Liberia, and Buchanan, which is one of the major cities in Liberia, which has been named after one of the big politicians, American politicians, basically was in the hand of the AmeriCare. But the administration coming from the basically from United Nations branch of the United Nations, but was very complex, I would say, really bureaucracy of the WHO and particularly United Nations, I would say, it was really paralyzing. So if we would see something that we could crack, would never really happen. By the time that we report it, and it goes up and down, and then would never really would go through. And that's the reason later on I will show you that, in a matter of fact, really by the time that we establish our own ETU, thanks God there was no any case of the Ebola in Buchanan. And in a matter of fact, I know that 22nd of December, the ETU was opened, and as we are speaking, even today, I called somebody in Buchanan to get some statistic, and they told me they have 3 patients, but 2 of them has malaria, and somebody else has something else, and no case of the Ebola has come to ETU, American-built ETU in Buchanan. So they suppose in Liberia, they supposed really to build 23, 100 beds, and each 100-bed ETU, 100-bed patients for ETU, 200 staffs, 24 of them expatriates, half of them from United States, half of them from other parts of the world, particularly South Africa, Uganda, and also Kenya, but almost 170, 160, they are Liberians, and they have to be trained, and the training particularly really came from the servicemen of the United States. And I would really talk a little about them later on. We were put really in very nice hotel, a Spark Hotel, and some of, Andrew is from Uganda but lives in the United States, and I think really she's from Kenya, and then from Uganda, and from Kenya, from Ukraine. These 2 engineers, they are from Ukraine, and he is from South Africa, and he's also from South Africa, and he's from Kenya, and he's also from Kenya. So you can see it's 12, or half of us, we were from Africa, and half of us, we were from United States. We repeatedly were told that this is a mission. So this is not really a job, this is not a task, this is a mission. So we couldn't really go anywhere. So we would be bussed from the basically hotel to basically ETU, and then from ETU back. And if we want to go really for instance, some shopping, we have to really go, together. Safety was in place because security, particularly at the beginning, you remember, was not really great in West Africa, but during our time, it was very safe, and I really didn't see any sort of really evidence to be concerned about safety in Liberia. And also, this is really a photo from my window. You can see this is a beautiful ocean, but I just want to show you that this is kind of the buildings that during 1980s, they're supposed to become really phenomenal buildings, but then political erosion happened. Then, the civil war happened. Many of the owners of these buildings, they were killed, executed, or they ran after their life, and they left it behind. And the people here, I was thinking that really this is a store, but in a matter of fact, it turned to be only a home. And it was almost 6, 7, 9, 10 people that were living here. And I was watching them whenever I had really time, and they were just sitting there. And the poverty is really bleak, and they're so nice, so beautiful, and so culturally really rich. I can talk really forever about the history of the Liberia, and I think really they are Americans, and they are Americans. Basically in 1800, we encouraged them when they were basically liberated. They were from captivity. I think we had almost, I would say, 250,000 out of 1.7 million of the African American. They were free. And we encouraged them to get back to another part of the world because we were thinking they cannot really compete with whites, and let them go. So they encouraged them to go, but then established really, finally, beautiful really country in the West Africa. I showed you basically the structure of the population, and you will see overwhelming majority of the population are very, very young. I shall say the country is really very poor. 94% of the population, they have no electricity. So basically everybody who has electricity probably has private run generator, something like that, but I do not think that there is anybody else with electricity. And when we were in Monrovia, we were trained again by the Department of Defense, and I can talk forever about the American servicemen. They were amazing. They were passionate. They were knowledgeable, and they trained us really very well. And before really we went finally for the hot training to Bank County. And University of the Cottington is very famous, or not really famous, whatsoever you would like to call it, because during the Charles Taylor time, you remember the crimes that Charles did during the time that he was in power, and I think it was 2012 that finally the court, got his neck, and he should have spent 20 years in prison. But this Cottington University became the training site for militia of the Charles Taylor, and this is a beautiful little campus. I know that Margaret was in this basically compartment. I was basically down this hill. And then I just wanted to read. The only thing that I remember, not really the hot zone, because I had a lot of fun, really, to be honest, in hot zone with the patients.
Not in Nairobi.
But Nairobi flies. Nairobi flies, they were everywhere. And these are Nairobi, these are beetles. So not really basically flies, but they're coming from that part of the world, but they are now everywhere. Particularly Liberia is a phenomenal site for the pedierus. Because they, practically speaking, live on the vegetations, and Liberia has 200 to 400 inches of rain annually. And I was reading one of the books that was written, in 1800, and somebody said, in 8 minutes, they got 1 inch of the rain. So 8 minutes, and it's true. When the rain comes, to be honest, you cannot see nothing. And when it comes, it doesn't come for 1 hour or 2 hours. It comes sometime for 10 days. And that was the reason many of the dead bodies, they were floating just on the streets. And now they are putting really in deep, basically, graves. 6 feet should be the minimum really depth of the graves. And this was, and this has the pethidine toxin. And pethidine toxin is symbiosis between a Pseudomonas, in a matter of fact, and this beetle, and is a toxin, and doesn't bite, and just it comes, and then you try to brush it off. That's enough, because that juice comes out, and then you don't know, But then 72 hours later on, you would see, unfortunately, a big ulcer. It's like the recluse spider. It just basically dissolves all of the tissue. And how many of the young American, I saw nursing staff particularly with this tattoo on the neck, on the face. And I said, this is the tattoo of a good person. If you're a good person, you're in the West Africa, you have to have this tattoo. And then unfortunately it becomes also superimposed infection very frequently. And then they have to be on antibiotic really for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And I remember Kelly, one of the nursing staff, constantly was scratching her side. It's just, that was my room. And then if you want to believe me or not, this is my bed and this is my desk. So I work on this side and basically I sleep in that. But I did have the fan. And then you would see basically the leper colony and then Ebola treatment unit. And particularly it is off the road and then leper colony. And basically it's very good analogy, in a matter of fact, because the people with Ebola were basically dismissed or expelled from their community. And I know the time is short, but let me only just focus on a few things to wrap it up. No medication we could offer. The only thing that was basically hydration, both for us and for the patients. That's the only thing. Into palliation, we didn't have really any medication, and the fear was so dense that nobody really would spend much time with each patient, to be honest. And that's the reason, because of fear, we do not know the spectrum of the disease with Ebola, how they die. We know they have abdominal pain. But what kind of abdominal pain? They have really, for instance, you mentioned, muscle pain, joint pain. Is only a checkbox, and it is not really a continuous observation. We were debating if we need 6 liters of fluid a day, or we need really 4 liters of the fluid a day that we would receive. Based on some calculation, in matter of fact, we calculate that we need about 6 liters of fluid a day, because when you spend really 100 minutes in the PPE, when you come out of the PPE, you have lost 3% of your weight. That's a good way for those of you who want to lose weight very quick. So, and then the outcome, obviously, there were survivors, but, the mortality, as you remember, was about 60-70%. And then this is the outcome. Many of them really, they lost their lives during the epidemic. The ETU of the Americans, they were like, beautiful, luxurious, is just amazing. And we did have really even the observation unit. But as I said again, things were so slow. They went so slow by the time that they were open, and there was no any patient left that to be studied by anybody in Liberia. And this is a very recent slide just to show you the different parts of the West Africa and how many days they have been completely free of the Ebola. And I tell you that in the last 10 days, there has not been even one single case of the Ebola in Liberia. And Monday, the schools are going to be opened. And almost during November, we had more than 2,000 of the cases of the Ebola in West Africa per week. And this is even 10 days old. Now it is about 240 cases weekly, but still we do have plenty number relatively in Sierra Leone and Guinea. This is Cecilia, and she was working in ETU, and she lived with her parents. Both of them, they have leprosy. And she wants to show me the leper colony, but obviously I couldn't go because I told you that I couldn't really go anywhere. So those of you who think that we went to Liberia and we saw any place, to be honest, no. We only went between the hotel and ETU back and forth. That's all that we did. So, and then Cecilia basically was born in leper colony, and the parents both, they have been disabled from leprosy. This is really Bendu. She's really a survivor of the Ebola. And this young girl, she survived, but unfortunately the mother and the sister died. And her name is Seta, and she's Anita. And Anita is 16, lost her sister and also mother, and then commit basically the entire life, basically 24 hours almost, to take care of the patients with Ebola. And you can see this one, the smoke comes from the basically burning, but not really the body. They are not really burning the bodies. Everything else goes to, should be burned in hot zone. This is the hot zone. And then you're totally surprised, how come really a lady with blue, basically scrub and no PPE works in hot zone? Because she's a survivor, and we know that she's immune, so there is no need really for any protection, and she was doing the toughest job. And she was recruited by the ETU, and she also was recruited by ETU, and both of these two now, they have basically a supporter from United States, Dr. Petrini in Dr. Ahmadi's office. She's basically sponsored both of them to go to a school. She wants to be a nurse, and Dr. Petrini agreed just to transfer the fund, fund till time that she's really going through to the nursing school. She was sponsored by one of the librarians, in a matter of fact. Somebody wants to sponsor her, but she was sponsored by one of the librarians. This is another survivor. They are in shock because in 10 days, imagine what happened to them from when they have everything to the time that they had nothing. They don't know exactly what happened to them, and they believe this is a curse. Maybe they did something bad. This is a sin, and it's amazing, really, experience when you are dealing with them. Anita, beautiful woman, 16, and as I said again, Seta, and they were like following each other like a shadow. I remember when I came from Barn County, I was asking Margaret, please tell me what's the story, what happened, and I tell you that she was basically grandmother and grandfather, and also, as I said again, she was put in a school by Dr. Petrini, and she's now back to school next week, basically is going to go to school, and again, we have a sponsor for the entire education from United States. Beautiful things happens in ETU, and this is Thursday night. In this side are the members of the ETU, on the other side are the patients of the ETU, and they're watching basically a thriller. I don't know what was the name of the movie, to be honest. I'm not very good, but this is the boots. So this is the boots yard. So you know that this is the basically ETU, and then this is the curtain, basically, and then the movie. And then you can see the both sides. These are the patients on this side, and they have a smile. You will say, my goodness, I go to a place that 60%, 70% of them, they die. Maybe I never see any smile. To be honest, Bindu, the first day I went to Bindu, she was by the bedside of a child, and then I told her that basically your blood test finally is negative, and you can go home. And she started dancing. She started really dancing around that bed. Amazing, really. Human is amazing, beautiful, really, species. And they will find good things. It doesn't matter where you put them. And this is really last day that I was heading back to United States, and this is the you were recruiting, and I was training. I was just basically training, some, and I love this photo because one of the lessons and principles that everybody needs to follow in ETU is no physical contact, no body contact. So, and you can see the contact is intimate here. And if somebody has Ebola, maybe it's going to spread the Ebola. James is really one of our basically, employee of the ETU. James is 42, and one day he told me his story. He said that I was in Monrovia, and I was in my PPE. And then I saw my older sister bringing my younger sister to the ETU. They didn't know that I'm working in ETU. And then the younger sister was obviously had vomitus, had nausea, vomiting, all of the manifestation of the Ebola. And the older sister was completely fine. And James tried really to convince the older sister to stay in ETU. Said, listen, my sister, look, the vomitus is everywhere on your, basically, dress. You're contaminated. And the young sister was 11, and she loved really books like James. And she said, listen, the Ebola is alive. And the old sister said, listen, I have so many other things to do. And she went. 3 days later on, the young sister is dead. And James is doing his responsibility and his job. And this is one of the afternoons, and it was said really, the entire floor of the ETU was covered by dead bodies. Entire. And this is the August of basically 14, when we have so many deaths in Monrovia. And almost many of the ETUs are closed, and the people would go home and they die on the streets. And it's really, as I was really finding my way from one dead body to another dead body to go to the bed, I'm hearing a familiar voice. I said, my goodness, this voice is so close to my ears. And he finds and would say, suddenly he saw his older sister. And the older sister was moaning, and then James would say, sister. And then the sister opens eyes, would say, James, my heart burns. Bring me cold ice. Let me put it on my chest. And he's in PPE. It takes 20 minutes, even if you rush to go out, take off your PPE, grab some water. Said, I couldn't really get any ice, but I got a couple of really bottles of the water. It is so hard to transfer anything from basically low risk zone to the hot zone. And then he comes, and the sister basically is gasping, and he grasps the sister, and then the sister dies in his arms. And he is now in Buchanan, and he's helping the other patients. And I said recently, and that was the time that the Time magazine called us heroes, or man of the year, or the woman of the year. And I said, really, you people are heroes. You have lost 2 of your sisters, and now you're helping the others. Who am I in a scope of what you have done? I would be dead if this would happen to me. If even 10% of what happened to you, it would happen to me, I couldn't even breathe. I'm going to be paralyzed. I would be depressed. I wish I could have a gun and I would blow my head. And he's really taking care of the, but anyway, I want really to finish up with only one message. And that's really the animals and the people are interconnected. Ebola virus, then we have the bird flu, then we had SARS, we have MERS, we have Nipah, simian foamy-virus, Hendera virus. And then if you look at really the order of the hand wings or chiropterans, imagine we have 1,100 species. In the other hand, 25% of the mammals over the earth, they are basically the bats, different species of the bats. They live in large colonies. Amazingly, you can find 300 of them hanging over 1 square foot. 300. Intimacy. If they have some secretion that needs really to go, they have it. And then they fly 800 miles, and they go up and down, and then vertically, and you mentioned you're 3-dimensional when they want to spread the virus. And amazingly, really, we do not know even the immunity of these bats. Nobody has studied the immunity of bats. I was very much interested to know exactly why really the bats, 5% of them, they have this virus. And this virus lives very peacefully in the body of this 5% of the bats. First, why 95% of the bats do not get this virus? And why this 5% of the bats are coming down with the virus? And if they are coming down with the virus, why the virus doesn't kill them? Because we know that the bat is 50 million years old, And as I said, the virus is 100. I don't know when the marriage between the virus, Ebola or filoviruses, and the bat occurred, but in 5 patients that I told you that they recovered the Marburg virus, there were 5 different strains of the Marburg virus. That means that the virus was completely adapted with each of the bat over millions of the years. And these are the number of the viruses that you would see in bats, or the bats as the reservoir. This is probably even incomplete lists of the viruses that the bats is carrying around. Thiamin, rabies. Look at the SARS, coronaviruses, Marburg, Hendra, and I would bet finally Ebola virus, also the reservoir is going to be in the bat, because I told you at least we have the pieces of the RNA, we have everything except the proliferation of the virus in them. And this is only one species. We have so many other insects, we have so many animals, and we as a human species, we are 7 billion. And we go everywhere. Everywhere that is food, we go. Everywhere which is gold, we go. It doesn't matter, this is in a remote place of Uganda, on the top of the mountain, or on the depth of the ocean, we go. We are touching and breaking the ecosystem, and we are going to expose ourselves to unknowns. Except we put very nice infrastructure in resource-limiting countries. Except we fight against poverty. Except we fight against human right violations. We are deemed to be conquered by a virus. I have no question in my mind that sometimes in future, another virus is going to come and conquer us. It's time really to get all of these lessons from the West Africa. The virus gets the opportunity, is going to move on. And I think really, I'm very delighted to tell you that in December of 2014, Washington passed $5.2 billion for the emergency funds to confine and find a solution for the filoviruses in West Africa. Majority of this fund goes to the CDC and National Institute of Health. Is going to be basically for the research, for the vaccines, or for the medication, but also plenty of this money is going to go to USAID, and that USAID is going to support really putting infrastructure in West Africa. And I hope that really in a couple of years, the infrastructure is very great in West Africa. And I hope after this tragedy, another Rwanda is going to come about. Rwanda, after genocide, became Rwanda. And I hope that after this tragedy, public health tragedy in West Africa, another new West Africa is going to come up, and at least is going to shake us as a human, that human species is so related, it doesn't matter where we are family, and we are responsible for each other. Thank you really very much, and if there is any question, I would be delighted to answer. Yes.
You had mentioned that from the MSF data that when they looked at people who had become, healthcare workers who had become infected, that the nationals had a much higher mortality rate.
Yes.
What do you think contributes to that? Because presumably they're working within the MSF.
You're right. I think we interviewed many of the members of the ETU, because in Buchanan we had the opportunity to recruit many of those that already work in ETU of the MSF. Many factors. First, during the summer, really, there was no PPE. There was no PPE. There was not even gloves. There was recent publication in morbidity, mortality, basically of the weekly report of the CDC, and they investigated outbreak of the Ebola among 5 or 6 of the healthcare workers in one of the centers in Monrovia. And the bottom line was basically there was not break in the protocol, there was no any PPE. And I was talking to some of these members of the ETU, and this is what they told me. They told me that really they didn't have even sometimes gloves, and they go to the hot zone, they would come out, and then they spring their entire body with 0.5 of the percent of chlorine, that the skin should not be exposed to the 0.5% of chlorine. So that's what they were doing to compensate for the lack of the PPE. And the second one, as I said again, there are not very many of the healthcare workers in West Africa. There are many sisters, many had mothers with Ebola, and they have really to take care of them. So they acquired the disease outside the hot zone. Nobody so far, as I was speaking, with the PPE has acquired the Ebola. Unfortunately, because of the fear that we had, not based on the evidence, based just on the frenzy, I think really we are adding every single day a new layer to the PPE, and unfortunately that makes really the efficiency and patient care worse. In a matter of fact, I think really simple PPE probably would be more than enough. But unfortunately, as I said again, there are some hosts that are very susceptible to the Ebola. It's not the virus alone, because I have seen 25 members of the family, they are completely gone. And there is another family with the same case scenario, there were only 1 or 2 people that died during that epidemic. There is some host, basically, susceptibility that nobody has basically shed light on that mystery of the virus. And as I said again, unfortunately, because of fear and fear and fear and fear, nobody has studied the virus. So as we are speaking, we know more about the nucleotide repeats of the virus than know exactly what the virus is doing. I saw many of the patients really in ETU with bladder distension. And I was thinking, really, how come really they have bladder distension? And then I was reviewing some really books by somebody who wrote, almost 20 years ago. And he mentioned in his notes that many of their patients in MSF ETU in Congo, they had bladder distension, but nobody has really looked why they have really bladder distension. This is non-obstructive, basically, or this is something damaged to the central nervous system, the base of the brain. Nobody has done any, as we were speaking, nobody has done even one CSF study in any of the patients with Ebola. I think really many of the people are thinking that patients, they die from the dehydration. That was not my observation really. My observation was basically the patient in ETU is young, not dehydrated, pulse is good, I don't have any blood pressure, cough, I didn't have any stethoscope, I couldn't really get any, I shouldn't really take any stethoscope, physical examination was very, very limited, and then they have really bladder distension. I put a Foley in one of them, in less than 8 hours, the patient had about 2,400 cc's of the urine. So this patient has diabetes insipidus, but I don't know exactly why and what kind of diabetes insipidus. There is nothing that we can do because everybody is afraid to touch any specimen that comes from the patient with Ebola, except we put away that unnecessary fear. We are not going to understand the Ebola mystery. Yes, John. How are you?
Good. So from my understanding, one of the issues too with working with people in West Africa was the understanding of a lot of the citizens of how to take care of themselves. That there's chlorine buckets that people would have to wash their hands in, and that there's also part of it was a movement against some of the physicians from the West coming in to. Did you see any of that? Is there any? Was there any type of education to the people there about Ebola?
Yes, we spend so much time really to teach about Ebola to expatriates as well as Liberians. I was in charge of that part of the education, in matter of fact. The first day that the ETU was opened, and we learned that there is a patient in basically suspect case is coming, entire ETU was frozen. Nobody knew what to do. Even they didn't open the gate. They are so afraid of the Ebola. So afraid of the Ebola. And I think really coloring kills the virus. Recently, even we have evidence that virus would not survive more than 7 days in the dead body, because we were thinking dead body may carry the virus forever, but it's only 7 days, because it's also reasonable, because the virus needs a live cell. If the cell is dead, so the virus can't really survive. But training was intense, but basically when it's the atmosphere of fear, I do not think really anybody would let the data penetrate, and analysis of the data under the fear is basically not happening. Yes, Christopher.
So you mentioned that the snakes, pythons, eat the bats. The pythons, they eat the bats that carry Ebola?
Yes.
Do they get affected the same way that primates do, as far as can they carry the virus with them, or do they die as
The only species that so far can become a reservoir for the virus is bat. Not all of the species of the bat. Some of the animals, they are very resistant to the virus, like horse. So we are making basically, injection Ebola to the horse to make the antibody. For instance, the Russians were doing that. Recently one of the Russian scientists died because he was working on a horse, basically. But dogs, majority of them, it sounds to me very much resistant, because when you review the literature, you will see a dog, in matter of fact, likes to lick the vomiters, licks the vomit. So, but they do not come down with the virus. But overwhelming majority of the mammals, they are susceptible to the virus and they die from the virus. I think really there's some literature I was reviewing very recently from Gabon epidemic. Almost the entire population of the chimps and gorilla, they were completely dead from the Ebola. By complete, complete. They did have just something like 14,000 of the chimps and gorillas in one part of a big park in Gabon, and I think really recently they identified only 1 or 2 of them. So they die very quick. But the human, mortality, as I said again, if leave the Mother Nature to take over, 70% is the mortality with Zaire, but Sudan or Bujumbura is much less. But with Zaire, it's almost 70%, 60-70% of the people, they die. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Sadigh, for the talk. I liked the slides that you had about the going from patient 0 or whatever, and
yes.
The mobility of the virus, and then mentioning that ultimately it was 64 people that died in the span of 3 months, and talking about that virulence as compared to other viruses, and saying it's really not that. It's really not that infectious. Could you give us some frame of reference, either like other viruses that would have, like how many numbers we could have expected other viruses to affect in that amount of time, or other illnesses that we know are going on, like malaria, that are, number of new cases that would come up,
Certainly. I think really rabies is 100%.
Yeah.
So you don't want to come down with rabies. There's only, I think, really 1 survivor of rabies that I remember. So the virus is 100% fatal. And filoviruses, I can't really say that is 70% they are fatal, because they are fatal because they are in West Africa. And West Africa, to be honest, they have nothing.
Yeah.
So in United States, I have 1 survivor of rabies, and I have everybody with filovirus, except for the 2, and basically they are cured. I know a certain number of the encephalitis from bats, 50% of them they die. SARS is very high number of people, but again, in Western countries, when attack, you remember the SARS attacked the California, then Canada, I think really, even here mortality was close to about 30%. hantavirus, for instance, among the Indians, it had extremely very high mortality as well. So, but other viruses, they are much less, I would say, furious. Yes, Mario.
I wanted to ask what you thought the prospects were for the future in Liberia.
Yes.
As far as this investment that has been made in buildings, infrastructure,
Yes.
human resources,
Yes.
being able to transition that into some real improvements in the health
Exactly.
infrastructure.
Exactly. I obviously, because of time, I didn't really have enough time to spend on that. But right now we have so many of the ETUs in basically Liberia. And now the members of the ETUs, in a matter of fact, they are helping the schools to be opened next week. So they are training the community. Many, I think, really, particularly Liberians, they were very successful because outreach to the community was very successful because Liberian, it's funny, just I say that, they hate the government. But the head of the government is Larner Lecture. They would say, my Ellen. So whatsoever Ellen says, they follow. In a matter of fact, they had significant influence on the confinement of the Ebola in Liberia. John F. Kennedy Hospital and Medical School was shut down, and I think really, I do not like really to criticize anybody, but 7, 8 of the American university, they were helping John F. Kennedy before basically March. As soon as they learned about the Ebola, all of them they withdrew, including non-governmental organizations, including Colorado University, Yale University, Harvard University. You mentioned all of them they withdrew. I think really, we have to get back. I think really, academia, as medical school, we have responsibility, to be honest. I think really, we are raising and training a new generation of the doctors. Our doctors should be global doctors. And that's a part of our responsibility at this point of time. How I can teach a young doctor if I'm not a role model? I think really, I know that the curriculum, all of the curriculum, we focus so much on the curriculum, and we totally ignore the hidden curriculum, role modeling. It was shame when I learned that, for instance, some of the universities, they had a few of the faculty that they want to go to Liberia, but medical school said, we are not going to give you 6 weeks of the time off. They should. There was fantastic really article written in New England Journal of Medicine about academic response during the Ebola season in West Africa. So I would say we have the money now, and we have the resources, and I think really big university needs to write grants to the USAID and move toward the Liberia to support the only medical school for the entire really country. That should be a priority. And we have also, as we are speaking, probably 5,000 of the expatriates in West Africa, and they have really fantastic teachers. Some of them, like Margaret, was phenomenal. I think really, if we have that kind of the people and American academic in Liberia, we need to take advantage of them during the transition time. But during the transition time, I think really ETUs, they are becoming the more of the basically clinical sites for the malaria. But I hope finally they are going to take off the PPE, because if I have really malaria, I don't like really to go to ETU because nobody is going even to touch me with that PPE. It's much better really to go to a clinic at the middle of nowhere when somebody doesn't have the PPE and can examine somebody with fever than going to the ETU, because it's 7 layers between you and your patient, and you don't have a stethoscope, you can't really take any blood, you have no study, you don't have chest X-ray, you have nothing basically. So, and even when you come to a conclusion, you don't have any drugs and any medication. So I think the transition should be toward the capacity building, and it should be toward the infrastructure.
And I think I read the new report from Washington that how they are going to basically invest this $5.2 billion. And I'm very, very optimistic that the plan, at least on the piece of the paper, looks so nice. I want to close out with really serviceman, American serviceman. You know, they were amazing. This young American serviceman, 22, 23, 24, 25, we had 3,500 of them in West Africa. 3,500 of them. They were teaching. And then I would say they were basically, mopping the floors. And they were under the sun of the equator. Nobody can stay really under the sun of the equator more than 10 or 15 minutes. They built the ETUs. Admirable job. Lovely people. And I learned so much really from them. I'm telling you, that was my best university ever. And I really thank many people, my family, and also really Dr. Jeffrey, Ramin Ahmadi, and John Murphy, Tanya Burr, for their really support, because during those 9 weeks that I was away, somebody else was doing my job. Obviously, I was not doing my job. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.